Well, we're going to move on now to actually doing something very practical. We're going to try and write some of a sonata form movement in classical style, so Haydn or Mozart kind of style. And I'm going to start by thinking about the first subject. So this is going to be a kind of very practical exploration of actually how do you go about writing in sonata form, but it's also hopefully going to give a little bit of insight in writing in classical style. So one thing just to bear in mind with this, what do we often find in classical style? We often have textures that basically are melody and accompaniment. Often we don't have too many parts on the go. Might just be 2 parts, sometimes 3 parts. Sometimes it's going to be more. Sometimes something more dramatic is bound to happen. But often fairly simple textures. The melody doesn't have to be in the right hand, but it often is. We quite often have kind of measured phrase lengths, 4-bar phrases, 2-bar phrases, kind of pairs of phrases where one phrase answers the phrase that precedes it. So just things to bear in mind. Fairly simple harmony. We're not trying to do anything overcomplicated. So just sort of general stylistic things to bear in mind if you want to compose in classical style. But it doesn't really matter if you're not out to compose in classical style. It's just kind of getting a bit of confidence in, goodness, how would I go about writing something in sonata form? So in this video, we're going to focus on putting together something that could be a relatively short first subject. You might well want to write a longer first subject, but for the purposes of making a video of containable length, I'm going to write a first subject, share it with you as we go, that's going to be kind of a manageable starting point. So we need to pick a key. Let's pick G major. So I'll put a key signature in for G major. Let's select a time signature of 4/4, common time. And let's write a melody in the right hand with a fairly simple accompaniment in the left hand. And actually, I think what we're going to do in the left hand is to write an Alberti bass. That's where you take a chord and you go bottom, top, middle, top, bottom, top, middle, top. It's a very typical classical feature. And it's a useful way of writing because it means you don't have to keep changing chords all the time. You can kind of just keep it going by having a rhythmic momentum that comes out of this Alberti bass without the chords having to move at a fast pace. But we need some kind of melody that's going to go over the top of it. Well, melodies in the classical period are often not overcomplicated. So let's have something like this. We're perhaps going to start by spelling out the tonic chord. So these are notes that belong to the tonic chord. And I'm going to write a 2-bar phrase just to keep this as straightforward as we can. And if we start on a tonic chord, well, probably in the second of these bars, second of these measures, we might want to go to a dominant chord. You see how straightforward that harmony can be. So that would give us an opening phrase. Very simple phrase. Okay, so you hear how that goes. And then what I'm going to do for the next 2 bars is write an answering phrase to the one that we've just written. Because if you had a whole series of short 2-bar phrases that didn't belong to each other, the whole thing would sound a bit disjointed. So it's almost as if the first 2 bars have posed a musical question, and now we're going to supply a musical answer. It's very typical of the kind of graceful, elegant classical style. So how can we do that? Well, better put a key signature in, haven't we? How about we do something like this and we use that dotted rhythm at the beginning that we had towards the end of the last phrase. It's just a way of kind of bringing in threads from the previous phrase. But doing something that's a little more sort of scalic, because the first one had that opening leap of a third. And this time, sort of implying something that starts with dominant harmony and comes back to tonic harmony. So you see what we've done in the first two bars, we've gone from the tonic to the dominant, and then in the second two bars, we go from the dominant back to the tonic. This is just keeping it nice and straightforward. So I've now got a pair of phrases that belong to each other. So how do they sound together? So hopefully you can hear how that second phrase is not unrelated to the first phrase. It's saying something different, but the first phrase starts here, the tonic chord goes there to the dominant chord. The second phrase starts there, the dominant chord comes back to the tonic chord. And there's something in common in terms of the melodic design of the second phrase with that of the first phrase, but there's also something a little bit different to say. Okay, now we've already said what we're thinking about doing with the harmony. So let's see if we can put some left hand in. If the first bar, the first measure, just wants to be a tonic chord of G, well, it'd be a little bit tedious if I just did this. Then maybe moved on to a dominant or a dominant seventh. I mean, we could do, but if we break it up and do a bit of Alberti, you'll see what I'm getting at. Okay. So do you see what I'm doing? I'm taking that G major chord and I'm going bottom, top, middle, top. And then I can do it again in the second half of the bar. And we'll hear how this sounds in just a moment. So that's the first bar, first measure. You see that? Just that movement in the left hand, very typical of Mozart or Haydn, but it creates a kind of rhythmic energy. If I just put the chord down, doesn't sound wrong, but it's a bit kind of plain, isn't it? But hear it with the Alberti bass. It's got a little bit of momentum. Okay, so let's carry on in the next bar. We said we were going to use a dominant chord. I'm now thinking, well, let's make that a dominant seventh, slightly more interesting. Taken that the bass started on G in the first bar, I'm going to move it up to A. So in fact, we're going to write a dominant seventh chord, but in its second inversion, because we don't want this to sound too much like a sort of solid cadence, you know, 1, and then 5, because it's just going to sit down. We're going to go 1 to 5, but let's make it 5, 7. Let's put it in second inversion. And then there's some sense of onward movement from there, isn't there? So in order to get the seventh in, can you see what I'm doing with this? The chord is obviously D, F sharp, A, C. And I'm working from A because I'm doing it in second inversion, going up to the D, nipping down to the seventh, going back up to the D again. And of course, I'll repeat that to follow the pattern of the first bar. Okay, so let's hear what we've got so far. Here's our completed first phrase. Sounds all right, doesn't it? And then we're going to carry on with the same idea as we move into this second short phrase. And this time, I've taken that we've moved to a 5-7 in the second bar, the second measure. I'm going to stick with 5-7 so we can then resolve it into the last bar of the second phrase. But maybe let's just shift the inversion, partly because I've got A in the melody there. So do I want to have A down here as well? Probably not. So why don't I start it on F sharp? So it's still going to be the dominant seventh chord, but I'm going to put it in first inversion. And then we'll have the same upper pattern that we had before. And you'll hear the impact of that in just a moment. And then we could stick with the F sharp or we could move up to A. It doesn't really matter. And have the same pattern again in the second half of this bar, this measure here. So that's that. And then let's just finish this off because now we want to go back to the tonic chord. Now you might be thinking, well, you've got a problem there because what's this C got to do with the tonic chord? Well, in short, nothing. But it could be an appoggiatura onto the B. which is a very typical ornament from the classical period, whether it's written as an ornament or whether it's just written out in full. So that C becomes a kind of leaning note that resolves into the B, and that will actually strengthen the cadence and feel a little bit more classical in style. So I'm going to go back to my original tonic chord. So we're fulfilling what we said at the beginning about starting on chord 1, going to chord 5, then starting with chord 5, coming back to chord 1. But you can see the detail of what we've done there. Now, how does this work and how does that appoggiatura work? Have a listen now to that second phrase just from here, and this is what we've got. You can hear that appoggiatura resolving. Okay, so the first 4 bars, the first 4 measures, 2 plus 2 in the phrase structure, this is what we've got. And you're beginning to hear how this first subject is taking shape. Okay, well, now we need to move on and maybe write another pair of phrases. And if we can write another pair of phrases of the same length, we've got a first subject. It will be about as short as a first subject wants to be. But my purpose here is not to write the longest first subject in the world, but just to write a first subject. So you get the idea as to, well, how might we do that? Okay, now what I might do for the third phrase, because we've had the first 2 phrases presented as a pair, is that I might take the rhythm of the first phrase and give it a new melodic line. And also I might try to take it somewhere else in terms of chord, key. So let's see what we can do with this. So if we start it on G, we've had quite a bit of stepwise movement and we've had small leaps, those opening thirds. Let's now be bolder and have a bigger leap. We'll go a whole octave. And then I'm thinking about moving towards a chord of C. Well, that's chord 4 in G major, but almost sort of suggesting a modulation to C, which might entail writing an F natural to make that happen. Now, if I write an F natural there, then I'm implying a dominant 7th in the key of C, a G, B, D, F chord, and that F is the 7th. The 7th will want to fall by step, but let me just show you something else. And again, this is a very kind of classical thing to do. We're going to resolve it entirely correctly to E, but we're going to interrupt the resolution with another little appoggiatura. But this time I'm going to make it an appoggiatura from below rather than from above, because at the end of line 2 we had an appoggiatura from above. I'm going to come from below and I'm going to make it chromatic. In other words, I'm going to use a D sharp, which doesn't belong to the key. So sometimes you get these chromatic appoggiaturas. Then I'm going to use an anticipatory note to go to an E, which will be harmonized with a chord 4, a C major chord. And you can see what I've done here. I've taken the rhythm of the first phrase. So the first phrase was... So now I've done for the third phrase. So there's a sense of progression about it, isn't there? There's a kind of slight ramping up of the emotional temperature, not radically, but just a bit. That octave leap is really quite pronounced, isn't it? And then it's a little bit sort of just vaguely ambiguous with the F natural D sharp. It's kind of, oh, where are we going? There's a sense that we're kind of going somewhere with this thing, almost beginning to develop the idea from the first phrase. Now, this is something that causes a bit of grief, because in sonata form, people say, oh, well, hang on, there's the exposition and then there's the development. So you can't possibly develop anything during the exposition. Well, we've already seen, haven't we, in the work of Mozart and Beethoven, how that actually does often start to happen. At one level, it's not a major development, it's a reuse of that rhythm of the first phrase, and it's designed to achieve some cohesion. The rhythm gives us the cohesion, but the melodic line takes us off in a slightly different direction. So we've got kind of new things happening as well. But in order to keep consistent with all this, let's maintain our Alberti bass. So we need a G major chord in this first bar, this first measure on the bottom line here. And I'm going to suggest we put it in first inversion, because then we'll have B at the bottom of the chord, and in the next bar B can go up and out to C. So there's kind of nice voice leading in the bass. So if I start this on B, and then we bounce up to G, back to D, back to G, you can see how I'm getting an Alberti figure, bottom, top, middle, top, out of this first inversion G major chord, which I'm going to keep going in the second half of this bar, this measure, because this G major chord then becomes a dominant seventh in C major. So what have we got in this bar? Now that means I can go on and use my C major chord and have it with that chromatic appoggiatura from below. And then we'll use it again at the end of this bar. Okay, now let's see how this is all shaping up. So this phrase on the bottom line now sounds like this. So you hear how that move towards C major goes. Have we modulated to C major, or have we used a secondary dominant in C major? Well, we'll see how it pans out. I think it's going to turn into a secondary dominant in C major, frankly. But it gives us a bit of harmonic movement. It gives us a little bit of colour in the melody with the F natural and the D sharp. It's slightly cheeky, isn't it? With that F natural going to a D sharp, it kind of teases something out, doesn't it? And then it all resolves on that final cadence. So we had a 2-bar phrase answered by another 2-bar phrase. So that kind of came as one block. Here's our next 2-bar phrase. It needs another 2-bar phrase to kind of match up with that. So let's now see if we can put in the last phrase. And what we want to do now is come to a cadence in G major, because we're arriving at the end of our first subject. I mean, you might well think, oh, that's far too short for a first subject. I want to write something much longer. I'm hoping you will say that. But you see what I'm trying to show you now is kind of how do we do this in a sort of condensed way so we get the process, get the thinking going. Okay, so we need a melodic phrase to finish off. And I'm sort of thinking, well, what often happens when we come to a cadence in a classical piece of music? We have chord 1 in second inversion, followed by chord 5 or chord 5/7, and then we go to the tonic. So I gotta kind of run with that. And I'm sort of thinking as well that we might use that dotted rhythm again, and we might also have a falling third there. You remember back at the beginning in this first measure we had a rising third followed by a falling third. So let's kind of go back to that, and then why not? We'll rise again. So we're making a bit of reference to that. If the first half of this measure, this bar, is going to be a 1 in second inversion, I'm now moving to a 5 and possibly a 5/7. And let's have a few eighth notes, a few quavers, just to energize the melodic line a little bit as we approach the cadence. So that's what I'm thinking there. And then we just need a cadence that's kind of going to go 5/1 or 5/7/1. Well, we might decide as it's the cadence, we're going to sort of pad out the texture a little bit, add a third part, and have a 5/7 going to a 1. And of course, you can see what I'm doing here. If that's a 5/7 there, we've got the third of that 5/7 that needs to rise. We've got the 7th of that 5/7 that needs to fall. So we've kind of dealt with all that as well. So our last melodic phrase kind of brings us back home, doesn't it? Which is what we want it to do. So that I think sort of works reasonably well. Using some of the material we've already done, we've got that dotted figure, we've got the falling and rising thirds, we've got the appoggiatura thing. And I'm thinking that we'll turn this into a double appoggiatura. We've had single appoggiaturas before. Let's have a double just to finish off the section. So you see how the material of one phrase relates to the material of another, giving us a nice sense of cohesion. The one thing to guard against is you don't just want to write a 2-bar phrase or a 4-bar phrase, then write another one that's totally different, another one that's totally different. On the other hand, you don't want to just keep repeating the same old thing. So it's kind of a bit of a balance, isn't it, between achieving variety and at the same time thinking, what are the threads that run through this? Okay, now we did say we'd use a chord 1 in second inversion. So let's do that here. So you can see I'm taking the second inversion of the G major chord and going bottom, top, middle, top. And then we're going to a 5 or a 5/7. Well, I've got the 7th in the right hand with that C, the second of those 8th notes, those quavers. So I'm going to sort of avoid the 7th in the left hand so we don't end up doubling the 7th. It's often not a good thing to do. But the 7th is all in the right hand. So in that bar, that measure, we've now got this, which all kind of works quite nicely. And then if I want to turn this first chord of the last measure, the last bar, into a double appoggiatura, well, I need to have a G in the bass to do that. And I'll move down to a D and then to a G, and then that will be a nice solid finish. So we get... So I've now got these 2 measures, these 2 bars. Now there is possibly the shortest first subject you're ever going to want. Okay, how does all that stick together? And can you hear how these various threads that we've discussed work? 2-bar phrases, so we've got 4 2-bar phrases, but they're coming as kind of 2 + 2, then another 2 + 2. Just think about melodically how things hang together. Where have we gone by step? Where have we used those thirds? What's the point at which we've had the biggest leap and the biggest kind of element of chromaticism? The third phrase, we've made that a kind of peak, haven't we, before things subside again in the 4th phrase. How the left-hand Alberti accompaniment gives us a consistency throughout the whole thing. How the chord movement has worked. Very simple chord structure. I've done that on purpose, but in the 3rd phrase, done something more ambitious. And how does it hang together as a first subject? Okay, how's that? So it just gives us an idea for this is how you could write the first subject of a sonata form. Now we're going to go on in the videos that follow to work on the other elements of the exposition. But I'm doing it in this way because I think this is quite a useful way of going about composing it. You see, people get bogged down in, oh, do I want an introduction? Do I not want an introduction? And then they spend hours trying to write an introduction and then either decide they don't want it or it doesn't actually belong to what they then write after it. So I think there's a lot to be said for, well, what's your first subject material going to look like? What's your second subject material going to look like? Then you can decide, well, does it need an introduction? Does it need a coda? Do we need something to link the first and the second subject? You can put those details in later. So I'm suggesting, as a way of doing this, that you begin by writing the first subject. And that's what we've just demonstrated in this video.